Welcome, everyone, to the Royal Talents Creators Studio Live and our special series, The Invisible Museum. This is our third installment. So excited to have everybody back. My name is Jeff Olson. I'm the Art Education Director for Royal Talents North America, and I'm going to be the sidekick today, not the host. We have a special guest, the incredibly talented and esteemed artist, Zhenya Gershman. Born in Russia, held her first exhibit when she was 14 years old. Moved to the U.S. and became the youngest student at the Otis Art Institute in L.A., eventually graduating with her Master of Fine Arts from the Art Center of College and Design in Pasadena. Her work is featured all over in prominent private and public collections. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Alex Award in Visual Arts. Most importantly for today, she is also an art historian and educator. She worked for over a decade at the Getty Museum, and her scholarly work is dedicated to uncovering new perspectives regarding the life and work of old masters, including Rembrandt and Durer. She's the co-founder of the nonprofit Project AWE, and she also is the founder of the Z Academy, where she mentors students of all ages. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Zhenya Gershman. Hey, Zhenya.
Hi, thank you, Jeff. I'm so excited to be back. Sorry we're a couple of minutes late. It's the mummy curse.
It was the curse of the mummy this morning.
But we want to undo that and completely take you on an amazing journey. And thank you for your patience and coming back for the third episode of Invisible Museum Tours. And we want to start by actually announcing our winner. We asked for a competition of submitting a poem inspired by the presentation of Vincent van Gogh from last Invisible Museum Tour. And drum roll, please. Marty Hill Bledsoe, beautiful poem. Please take a look. Actually, on our Royal Talents North America had reposted her poem with an original beautiful painting of irises and inspired by Van Gogh irises version that she created. It is really, really wonderful. So we will have the prize. Stay tuned to the very end of the show. You do not want to miss, because Marty wins an amazing Van Gogh set. Today we're going to be also announcing a prize for the Rembrandt oil set. So do not miss this. To be
Congratulations,
discussed
Marty.
at the end. All right, so quickly I'm going to start my PowerPoint so I can take you on a journey.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm ready.
Let's see, click here to start sharing screen. And tell me if you could see this.
Yep, we're in business.
All right, from beginning. All right, so today we're talking about the Fayum portraits. You're going to learn what they are, why they were made, when they were made, and why they're important for us, and why they're exciting. But before we go there, I want to ask you one important question. So this is for all of our audience to think about a very simple question. What is the most important thing that you need to do today? What is it that after you finish watching this tour on your list, to do, must do, do not miss, on your mind, burning to do? So while you're thinking that, and if you don't mind, remember this is an interactive tour. Please share your comments, questions. We will change the direction of the entire experience based on what you say. So I mean that. While you typing your answers or sharing with us, I want to ask Jeff, what is it the one thing that you need to do today?
Oh my gosh, I have to make a video today. An introduction for Realism Live.
Oh, that sounds exciting. That's interesting.
I know. So that's my immediate goal for the rest of the afternoon after our tour today.
Not surprised. You're going from one project to another. Any input from our audience, what they have to do today? While this is arriving, and we'll be able to also read it later as you watch the program again, and as the answers come in, let me just show you a Fayum portrait. Paint. Oh, great! Painting, excellent. We're going to switch to a Fayum portrait. Let's see. And here we have an example of a Fayum portrait, and if these were made 2,000 years ago, and they were made by real people like us, for real people like us, who had things on their mind, and the things on their mind were of utmost importance. But in Egypt, what you were concerned most was not with this life, but what happens after, the afterlife. So here comes the first quote that we're going to use today. It's an ancient Egyptian proverb. Why have you delivered yourselves unto death, having the power to partake of immortality? So why are you thinking about things to do that are in this life? Because you're going to be immortal. You're going to live forever. And so with every portrait, of course, when we look at the portrait and the history of portraiture, it always makes us ask a question. Who are we? It reflects back to, what am I today? How are the people different? What is special about me? But more so than any other portrait, the Fayum portraits not only ask you, who are you? But they also ask you, what is the difference between life and death? Is there a boundary? And what I'm going to argue today, they break that boundary and come right into our life and mix everything together. They're so odd because if, again, you look at this 2,000-year-old portrait, it is attached to its original mummy. So the mummy and the dead body is not separate from its portrait. The two come together. And in such a way, they're both living and dead. There's a hidden layer of the body and the revealed layer of the face. And they're living because they're simply looking out. It looks almost like a spacesuit where the portrait is wrapped around in those wrappings and it's looking out as if through a little window. To whom? To us, to you at home at this very moment. So there's a very odd thing because we know that thing is dead, but it's still looking at us now. We're living right here. That thing is dead, but it's looking at us. And even more weird, more uncanny, is that it's going to continue staring. So we know it's going to look at things that we won't be able to look at. So there's a kind of an eerie quality of this thing, that person, that what is it, that portrait that we're going to uncover today. And I wanted to mention also that the process of mummification in this time period, and we're going to really talk about this whole idea, how this tradition came to be and how is it so different from the rest of Egyptian practices in having this realistic portrait. Why did this happen? But it actually, part of the mummification process was to push the face back into the spine, a kind of a very uncomfortable chiropractic maneuver, so that the portrait could take the space and align perfectly with the front of your body. So the portrait took on your face. I mean, it's really a strange concept. So we don't think anymore as art in the museum or something to look at or something on the wall. This is you right there, a representation of us in the moment. So here I just wanted to come a little bit closer. We will unpack together the technique in which these Fayum portraits were made, but I wanted to right away show you the delicate details, the amazing spiritual quality, the communication of these faces that stare out at us. The next thing I wanted to say, amazing texture. The next thing I wanted, so the first thing, what is a Fayum portrait? The second thing, where they're from. So we already mentioned, you could guess that they're Egyptian, or they're made in Egyptian territory. And I usually don't show maps in my presentation, maps and dates. I always say dates are only important in refrigerator to know what's rotten, right? But art should be really immortal. Talk about our subject. But here the map is important because they were discovered. Majority of Fayum portraits were discovered in 19th century, and they were in the west bank of the Nile in Egypt, and that's why they get their name. We didn't even know when they were first shown, when they were first unearthed, and Jeff is wearing his amazing excavator's outfit, his archaeologist outfit today. So you can imagine Jeff digging out and unearthing. Exactly. When you're unearthing them, you don't even know what they are. In fact, many people thought that they were not original, that they were not ancient, that they were replicas because they look so modern. It was hard to believe. But they were found in this region of west side of the Nile because it's a drier region, safe away from the floods of of the Nile. And the Greeks, when they occupied the Egyptian territory, chose it as their burial grounds. And later, when the Romans came into the Egyptian territory previously occupied by the Greeks, they also buried in this area. And the Fayum portraits with their mummies were buried on this region, and so hence the Fayum portrait name. There's about 1,000 portraits that survive, which is, there must have been much more, but it's still an amazing amount to have bit death and decay and be present with us today. And just so you understand geographically, we're about 60 kilometers south of Cairo. All of them are painted by unknown artists. So while you can actually start seeing personalities in these portraits, and you could totally differentiate between Van Gogh and Rembrandt, you'll see. And they're better artists and lesser artists, as in any era. They are by unknown artists. Incidentally, if you were the painter of death, or you could say painter of life, we will negotiate which one it is that Fayum artists were. How were you paid? I just recently found out. Most artists at the time in Egypt, in the Greek or Roman time, were paid with wine. So depending on how well you painted, you'd get a couple of barrels of wine or 3 barrels of wine. So don't ask about what the relationship between artists and drinking, but that was the payment. So here I show to you the synchronicity between, I already touched upon this subject, the synchronicity of the three cultures, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. So in the center, you see a Roman guy. There is no mistake. I mean, he's standing in his toga. He's so Roman looking. His face, his hairdo, everything about him, his stance. The Egyptian, of course, preferred to show everything in profile, and he's standing frontally. And some of the Egyptian already gods are also shown frontally, because it is through the Romans' eyes that we're looking at these Egyptian traditions. Next to him is actually, we have Osiris on the left and Anubis on the right, and they symbolize the Egyptian cult of the dead. Anubis, of course, is this dog-like, half dog-like character that actually was partaking, the god of mummification, and he was the one who was the guide to the afterlife, and so he's often portrayed with the deceased, with the soul of the deceased. This is from 2nd century of our era, and this amazing Fayum portrait is actually at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where I was born and had frequented when I was a child. So talking about different museums, we went as far as Moscow today. But now I want to take you closer and look at this incredible portrait from about, again, they're all about 1st and 2nd century of our era. And we're going to Metropolitan Museum. Metropolitan Museum has an incredible collection of Fayum portraits, and they do them justice. Why, you might ask yourself, why haven't you seen them that much? Is because when you travel, the museums really don't know what to do with them. In the museum departments, you want to separate by subjects, but it's hard to figure out, are they Egyptians, or are they Greek, or are they Roman? Should they be in archaeological department, or should they be in the art department? Are they paintings, or are they artifacts? Are they sculptures, or are they paintings? Should they stay with their mummies? And so sometimes you'll even see it through different sections of the museums as you go around. But Metropolitan does a great justice to the Fayum portraits, and for that we are grateful. We're going to look at a few from the collection. So now I want you to stare into this amazing portrait. We're going to play a little game, and I want you to think, since these are real people, I want you to imagine as if you're meeting this person and guessing their life status. They walked into the bar. There's no COVID, so we can totally chat. And we guess upon his clothing and his stare and his hairdo, his background, his status, his job. What are some of the ideas? So I would love to hear from our audience. So please type your answers if you'd like to help us out here. Meanwhile, I asked Jeff if he has any associations, if he met this young man.
I met the young man in the bar.
Yes.
I would guess that he's middle class, maybe upper middle class, just because how clean, and the whiteness of the robe, the fabric, was not something that was that easy to come by. He's got that purple braid there, or at least it looks violet in my reproduction.
Yes,
And I'm sure
you're
that
correct.
symbolizes something as well, the nice addition to it. I'm assuming he's young, not necessarily clean shaven, so I'm assuming he's an adolescent, which means his clothing represents the wealth of his family. Neat
This is
cropped
great.
hair. Yeah, yeah.
He is so pleased with you right now. Do we have anything from our audience that we want to share?
We've got an eldest son, a favored son. He definitely has a sense of superiority from Leanne. Marla commented as well.
Excellent, excellent. So this young man is so thrilled with you because he was, and that says on his shirt, it's embroidered into his white toga, a freedman. He was a slave and he was freed. So slaves would occasionally be liberated if they had such a great craft, often because they were great artists, and they would be granted freedom and become an independent citizen. And so the first thing he wants to do is to have his portrait to be remembered forever, that Jeff in 2020 and Leanne and everyone would see him as a favorite son, as somebody who deserves his independence. So it really gives me goosebumps to think about that this
Marla
came
says he
through.
looks too young to drink to be in the bar.
To be in the bar. Okay, so this I bring you a little bit closer to his eyes, and here we start to see some of the texture that we're going to talk about, but also the way the eyes are rendered, the way the light is penetrating, especially on the left eye. You could see that redness even coming, shining through in the iris, his eyelashes, the beauty of even his eyebrow, how it goes from the dark and heavy to light and thinning, right? Incredible amount of details. That reflection of his nose, so realistic, so compelling, and really trying to connect with us. He's really asking you. If I didn't ask you that question, he's asking you that question. He wants you, who am I? Tell me, who am I? I am a free man, right? So he's really communicating. And here's another portrait from the Metropolitan Museum. I love this image because as we get closer to it, it shows, you see the nose? It shows a mole on the nose. And who would want to be remembered for 2,000 years and more and counting with a big black mole on his nose? But he does, because these portraits were about really capturing the likeness. These are not idealized portraits. These are not Beverly Hills Botox portraits. These is real deal. And we will ask this question in a moment. Why is it that these Roman Egyptians wanted to be portrayed exactly how they were and couldn't just pay a little extra to the artist and say, I don't want the mole, right? What was the deal with that? We're going to really consider this. But beyond that, I want you to remember that they're not just, again, they're not just portraits on the walls. They acquire the proximity of worn by the dead, the energy that's transferring from the mummy onto the portrait. So when you stand in a room filled with Fayum portraits, perhaps even getting a little bit of that charge through the screen into your home, but if you are in the actual collection and stand in front of them, there is a bit of a Halloween weird vibe that happens in the room. And there's a very famous scholar who shared in her book, we're going to look at her book at the very end of the presentation, a Greek painter, and she did a wonderful study of Fayum portraits. Her name is Doxiadis, very Greek name. She wrote in her book that while she was at the British Museum, this is where she did most of her research. British Museum has a huge collection of Fayum portraits, an amazing collection. She was alone. She was allowed to this room alone, and she was sitting with hundreds of these faces, and for a moment she knew she was alone, and all of a sudden she felt that somebody was watching her, and she felt very uncomfortable, like really stared at. So she assumed that maybe there was a curator or the director of museum who walked into the room, and she turned around and she saw a portrait like this. And she really felt stared at. And she included it in her art historical scientific book, this eerie quality. And so I was hoping that even from the screen, when you look at this young man as well, that you get this feeling of communication. Here's another young man from the Metropolitan Museum from about 2,000 years ago. And there's something really interesting. Jeff, do you notice anything about his eyes?
Well, the eyes are large, I think, for the size of his face, but there's something interesting in the one eye there. The eyelid seems swollen or unfinished, maybe.
You nailed it. All of these portraits seem to have an emphasis on the eyes, this kind of enlargement, and we'll also come back to it. I think it has to do with the way they perceive that the capturing, the entrance of the soul goes through the eyes. You kind of almost like widen them to receive your soul into the portrait. But you noticed absolutely astutely that the left eye has been altered, and what is thought that it shows an early eye surgery.
Hmm.
And Egyptians were very known for experimentation with medicine and their extreme knowledge in surgeries. And so it looks like a surgical cut that is actually correcting an abnormality in the eye. And again, here it is portrayed as part of his forever image, right, with this scientific innovation. Now I bring you to, we're going to talk about the materials in just a moment. Most of those portraits were painted on wood. In some rare occasions, they were actually painted on linen shrouds. And this is such example. You could already feel the texture is slightly different. But I want you to look at this young woman. Her name is also inscribed in the shroud. And for a moment, I would love for you to imagine her job. Now, women did have job in Egypt. Women's rights were actually quite advanced in Egypt, Roman territories. And I want you to imagine, who would she have been? I'd love to hear from our audience. Jeff, if you want to take a stab, it's just a guess. It's a real association. There's no right way to answer it because it's just staring and stereotyping, basically, right? You want to take a stab, Jeff?
Well, I think she's definitely some type of professional with that earring. I'm going to say that she was some kind of maybe doctor or lawyer or teacher.
Excellent. And our audience, do they have any guesses?
Um, Not yet. They're coming through still.
I love that you notice her earring. Many of these portraits display a collection of jewelry. I wore some jewelry today just to look a little bit more Egyptian. And many of them do show the person actually naked. And I think they wanted to show the kind of a purity of the soul, that your body is prepared to travel without your goods. So we see both extremes. All right. Unless we have any guesses, I'm
Somebody
going to
says
reveal.
hairdresser.
Hairdresser. All right. I tried to do my hair a little bit more Egyptian today. All right.
A
We're going to
letterist or a calligrapher.
Interesting. Beautiful. You're very close. It actually says Hermione Grammatike. Grammatike means the school teacher. So it's incredible, right? Isn't that really fun? You were all very close. Jeff, too. You said a scholar, right? A teacher, possibly.
Teacher. Yeah.
A letter writer. And perhaps even part of the school, she would teach about hairdos and hairstyles. But it's really wonderful to see this woman commemorated and remembered. I also want to bring you closer to her eyes because it is painted on linen. There's a different kind of sensitivity in the painting. You could see that it's a little bit more watercolor effect, a little bit more transient, right? Translucent. All right, so I bring you these three personalities, and just to show you how different they are. And these people were not all there. They could be Egyptian, they could be Roman, they could be Greek, but there are other tribes and nationalities represented. So in the middle, we actually know that this was a Jewish woman, and she was a wealthy woman who could afford this portrait. On the right, most likely a Roman. You could see the much more Roman features. And on the left, and interesting, you can start guessing where this man is from, probably Egyptian, and much more local representation. So I wanted to show you the range of these portraits, kind of unexpected, and they were not all wealthy necessarily, as we saw the slave, and I hope the teachers were paid more than today, but I can't expect that the Grammatike, our teacher, was the most wealthiest, right? But here I have the word anima displayed on top of the middle portrait, and the anima represents the soul. And these portraits come from an earlier tradition. Even though they're painted 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago is actually relatively close to us compared to 400 BC. We go back another 400 or 500 years back in time BC, and we come to the Greek technique. And the Greek technique of painting that was really known, became known and celebrated by the one greatest artist whose name you might have heard. His name was Apelles. And Apelles was said to have painted the greatest. He didn't paint the likeness. He painted the anima, the soul. It was said that when you would look at his portraits, that you could actually foretell the future of the person, just like you could fortune tell by looking at the hand, just by looking how he portrayed you. And so I take you to introduce you to Apelles, who we think is responsible for the technique of these paintings. Now, Apelles lived 500 years or 400 years before Fayum Portraits, but the tradition is being carried over to Egypt through the Romans. And so we have, again, this very strange compilation of ideas. So I present to you to Apelles at his easel. This is a painting by 1793, an 18th century painting by an Italian artist, Gandolfi. And you could see that Apelles became a symbol for all painters. So even Rembrandt was sometimes referred to as great as Apelles. Albrecht Dürer, great German artist in Renaissance in Germany, was celebrated as our Apelles. You know, it comes up again. This was the greatest compliment you can give to portrait painter. In this recreation of the myth, we actually see Alexander, the emperor, coming down to Apelles, to his studio, to introduce him to one of the concubines at the court, who Apelles had painted, and painted so realistically, his reward is to actually meet her and be presented to her. It was thought that Apelles would create mirror-like images. And the name for the artist, today we say painter. It doesn't sound too glorious. The name for the artist was Zographos. Zographos in Greek meant he or she who paints life. Right? That who paints life. So we think about the death portraits, and yet they're painting life. They're immortalizing, right, through this tradition. And a specific technique, what made Apelles so famous, and what we see adapted in the Fayum portraits, is a technique of painting with 4 colors. They only used 4 colors. So if they went to the Rembrandt store, they would pick up black, white, yellow ochre, and red. Out of those 4 colors, they could achieve everything. And it was considered of this great taste that you could find the recipe, and depending on how you burned your black, because this is really soot, right? Or what kind of ochre, from which ground you dug your yellow ochre, or the red ground. If you knew the secret, and this would be orangey red or reddish red or golden ochre or brownish ochre, it would affect your paintings. So the technique that they use is encaustic painting, which means that, and that comes directly from Apelles. And caustic, really, the word encaustic literally means burnt in. And today, Jeff, at the end of our time together, will share how you can employ encaustic technique at home. It's not too difficult, and with the Rembrandt oil paints, you can actually mix wax and create beautiful simulated ground, just like you will see in the Fayum portraits. But because you're using wax, predominantly you used heated wax. So here I show a little picture of little jars where you would, on the burning plate, you would heat up your wax, and you would have to melt and pour your pigments inside, mix it very quickly. You had to work quickly with urgency, or else your paints would dry. And you would use metal tools to apply. Instead of a regular brush, you would use a metal brush. Here I show you modern tools that you can buy today. These are all wax painting tools. And you would apply very quickly the paint layers. And then when the painting dries, there was another way to blend. You would take one of those cestrum or needle incising tools, and you would heat up the tool itself. So the end of the blade, almost like a surgeon, would be heated hot. And you would touch upon your cool wax onto your painting and try to blend the edges. So you could continue molding and creating beautiful details. A couple of things I want you to keep in mind. The background was painted first, and usually the background was dark, and you would lay your colors on top of it to let them luminesce. And also you would quickly sketch out your proportions so that your portrait would be realistic, usually with tempera, which is basically your water-soluble paint. So you could take the same pigments and lay them out quickly so that you would have a beautiful design on your painting. Jeff, do you have any questions or comments or things you want to add here?
No, I think I'll save some of the technique and ways to create it for the end. I am thinking of asking if anybody knows contemporary artists who are using encaustic. I have one in mind in particular, but I'll save that for the end.
And we might have encaustic artists watching us today, people
Absolutely.
who use this technique. I'm very jealous. I have not, but I'm very inspired to try after Jeff's presentation today how to make my own Fayum portrait. Here I show you a fun image I found in the last hour right before going live today. And this shows us a sarcophagus from Crimea. It's now in Hermitage Museum. It's 1st century BC, but the reason I love it, inside the sarcophagus where the person was buried, there was a painting of a painter. So here we see on the left a young artist who's sitting there, and I don't know if you can tell what he's doing, but he's using that cestrum tool, that metal tool that we just saw in the picture, and he's heating it up in the flames so he could paint. And in front of him, to the right of him, there's a really kind of a self-made funny easel with 3 legs. And far to the right, there's a little guy, a really diminished guy, and even though he has a beard and seems more mature, he's actually an apprentice. He's an assistant, and he's carrying something in his arms, most likely the heated wax for the artist. So this is a wonderful image. Oh, by the way, on the wall, I forgot to show this to you, Jeff. Do you see what's on the wall?
Paintings.
Portraits, yeah, because if you come to his studio, you would be able to give him a commission. He's also doing an exhibition, right? Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Nothing changed, really.
I love this detail. Can you go back for a quick?
Yeah.
On this little column in front of him, it's like an open trifold. They've made an attempt to show that it's folded, and it's got a grid on it. I wonder if this is some kind of viewer that he's using to look at a person's face and grid out his drawing or something like that.
100%. Exactly what it is, right? Isn't that brilliant? And so they're so realistic. After Fayum portraits, as we will look at the tradition, we lose this ability to paint. We lose this ability to be realistic. We remember about it in Renaissance, but look at how much they knew, these tools, right? These advanced tools for perspective, really, right? And for transferring the proportions. Brilliant observation. Thank you, Jeff, for that.
You bet.
Yeah, just that image alone. So here I just show you something funny, something we can all relate to. When we go buy apples in the store, you'll often notice that they're covered with wax. And wax is Russian cannot say the word wax. Wax is a perfect tool for preservation. It preserves the longevity of the fruit or the vegetable. So it does in mummification, it could preserve, and so it does when you choose what paint to use. They could have used other paints. There were other paints available. In fact, even during the wax painting technique, the encaustic, they did sometimes add oil to the wax painting, and they also added egg to the painting. So there was a variety of things, but wax as a material, I want you to keep this in mind, it acts as preservation. So if you're going to paint the soul of the person, what better material than using wax paint, right? There's a kind of a poetic and useful aspect. If you're going to pickle the soul, use wax, right? Okay, so here I show you, now you will appreciate the surface even more, knowing what it took to create it. This is definitely a wax painting technique. And I wanted to talk about that. We've kind of been strong on the Greek tradition, talking about Apelles, the Romanist conquerors, and bringing in their ideas to the Egyptians. But what are they getting from the Egyptian? Why is this Fayum portrait born? It comes from the actual Egyptian concern of the fight against the death. And hence the portraits are thought not as portraits, but as soul catchers. And the Egyptians really thought that the soul is preserved within the body. And when the person dies, in the very moment they take the last breath, it exits. And when it exits, unless it recognizes another body to go into, it will be lost forever. And hence they created the mummies, because the mummies, in a way, the soul kind of hovers above and says, no, wait a minute, I'll come back right inside that body. That looks familiar. And then you can live forever, because you know the body is less important. It's just preserved to be a vehicle for the soul. So the Romans piggyback right on this idea, and they say, well, what if we paint realistic portraits in the style of Apelles? Wouldn't the soul really recognize itself even better than, of course, the mummy is already less representational? So that's why they create these paintings. That's why they want the imperfections. They want the moles and the triple chin and the surgery, because they want the soul to know, oh, that's her, right? They don't want to be confused. And so I want to show you, I want to go directly to the Egyptian representation of the soul. So here is a mummy. And this comes from the wonderful version of the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was something that's sold. It was a huge business and given to the ones who are about to die to take it with them. It was buried with the people because it had all the prayers and all of the wonderful spells for the dead. So if you're confused, if something happens, you'll have a spell for every occasion. One of my favorite spells, you could buy the Book of the Dead in English translation if you're interested. They're wonderful. One of my favorite spells is, you wouldn't think of it, but what if your shadow is lost? So there's even a spell for your own shadow. Right? So this is an illustration, an original illustration from the Book of the Dead, and we see the soul hovering above the dead. So they thought that the soul consists of two parts. It's not just one part. One is the ka and one is the ba. Ka was more of an, I would say, an essence, a life force. That is the thing that separates a death, and if it doesn't see its own portrait, is going to be gone forever. Then the ba can't be activated either. So it was very important to show the portrait to the ka in the moment of death. That's why sometimes we think these portraits were actually made during the person dying. I'm going to come back to this question. When were the Fayum portraits painted? But many believe it was actually in the moment. So as you take your last breath, the portrait is formed. You got to time it out as a painter. 3 barrels of wine if you're successful, and the soul goes back into the portrait. Now, the ba is the actual soul that was represented in the form of a bird. And it was represented in the form of the bird because it was believed to have a mobility, and it could actually hover between the living and the dead. It can actually go between the mummy and the living, between the mummy and the gods, but it always had to come back. As long as Ka was preserved, the Ba would return. Now, there's a sweet little feature in the pyramids that was discovered. A little perching window was built into the pyramid, so the Ba could come back and watch the sunsets and sunrise and fly and come back and perch. You always often also see the Ba sitting almost like a parrot on the shoulder of the deceased, always present with you. So I wanted you to keep this in mind. And I hope that it also explained a little bit more about how they felt these boards, these linen shrouds, would actually encapsulate the soul. So we don't look at them just as a portrait, but more like time travelers, more like soul catchers. So this is a portrait. I love the fact that here locally in Los Angeles, where I am, at the Getty Villa, we have a number of beautiful Fayum portraits that you could see in person, and including a very rare mummy portrait on top of the well-preserved mummy. And because the Getty has the resources that financial resources that most museums don't have, and they spend it very wisely on conservation, they were able to study this mummy more than almost any other mummy in the world. And it underwent a great analysis at the UCLA School of Medicine. So that's the place where we go locally, one of the best universities here, for CAT scans. And this mummy, by the way, you will see that there are two birds on its chest, right, painted. And also, this mummy has a beautiful bird of ibis, an Egyptian bird ibis, represented on the lower region of the abdomen of this mummy. And I want you just to keep this in mind. It went to get a CAT scan at UCLA, just like a person would. So there was a state-of-the-art analysis, and the doctors saw this mummy. And what they discovered was unusual and really amazing. It was not just the mummy preserved inside, but now we get the second drum roll, please. Over that belly was a mummified ibis bird contained within the mummy. Now, ibis was a symbol in Egypt, of Thoth, the god of writing and magic. So we think that there's some interesting extra message here, obviously. Whether this mummy was a priest, a high priest, and this was one of the symbols, whether it somehow helped with transferring to the other world and having Thoth on his side, we don't know for certain, but gives a kind of an amazing spin to this burial. I come to the very important part of our presentation. So here is not where we go, them and us. This is living with the dead. So in this tradition, in this newfound tradition established by the Romans, combining the Greek painting techniques and the Egyptian mummification practices, you would not bury the mummy. You would actually, we think that they stored them in special little closets in their household. And on special ceremonial days during festivities, where you shared meal with your family, with your children, with your grandparents, with a large extended family, you would open the closet and bring out the great-grandma, right? You would bring out your relative, and they would partake in the meal with you. They would partake in the ceremonies with you. They would break the bread with you. So this is really breaking our kind of understanding of how the boundary between the dead and the living. The dead would live with the living. And so I want you to think about for a moment, why would they do that? What was the point? How could they not bury these mummies? What was the reason? If you take a moment just to reflect, if you want to share it with us, I would appreciate it as well, and would be very curious to see what you think. I'll tell you right away, you cannot be wrong, because we don't know the answer. We don't know, was it out of the respect for the dead, or was it out of the necessity for the living to hold on to the dead? We don't know the answer. It's a very interesting, unprecedented tradition. Jeff, do you have any guesses, or do we have any suggestions?
Let's take a look. I think folks are still typing, yeah.
And while
I
they're
don't know, I
typing,
immediately thought of the Day of the Dead, since that's coming up too, and the Mexican tradition of spirits coming back during that special time, and things like the orange flowers that are placed everywhere to help them, guide them back so they can spend time with their families. It seems like a similar type of ceremony, to have them actually there physically as well as spiritually at important time.
So true, and we did this on purpose. Actually, we did want to pair. We're going to start pairing some of the Invisible Museum tours with what's going on in our real life. So thinking ahead that Halloween is just around the corner, wearing masks, right? Thinking about the dead and the living. So thank you for reminding me of that, Jeff. Very appropriate. I wanted to show you this wonderful portrait. I already mentioned the British Museum as we fly for a moment here to London. Has amazing collection. This guy is just so I mean, he's so real. He's overweight a little bit. He's got these large lips. He's so, it's like I know him. I feel like I recognize him. Jeff, doesn't he look familiar?
Yes, he does. It's a very distinct character. I was looking. We
Right?
got some comments now
Yeah.
on the previous question, and
Let's hear them.
Safira has something interesting. She said to keep connection with death was not viewed as something fearful, but as a continuation, like we are a continuation of our ancestors. I thought that was very thoughtful. And then I giggled a minute ago because somebody posted Weekend at Bernie's. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie, but
No, I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna have
you
to
have to check it
watch
up.
that.
A couple young men are saddled with the dead body of a guy named Bernie, and they carry him around everywhere with them. So
But I
a
love
little
this
pop
idea of
culture filtering
both
in today.
both through this pop culture, as I could tell, this idea of humor to overcome death, and also as Safira is mentioning, this fear that we have, this fear towards death, and I think that's what they're trying to do is break that fear and show the continuity rather than discrepancy. That it's not some kind of a threshold that you cannot break, but it is here now with us, right? And so this is very interesting because we come back. Anna, who works at the Royal Talents, was asking me right before we started, when were they made? When were these Fayum portraits made? During the person's life, after their life? This is what the art historians ask over and over again. And we come up with three different answers. Before the person died, after the person died, and during. And we see examples for all three. So it seems like there was a variation. So here is an example to prove absolutely that it was done basically very close to person's death, if not during, right? So there was a reconstruction done of his mummy's face with the latest technology. And this is what the mummy would have, if you brought the face back, would have looked like, almost identical to this man. And the British Museum carried out this project. They had it on an exhibition, and almost every mummy that they tried came to a very strong resemblance. So definitely proving the idea that they were not idealizing and showing the age very close to the age of the mummy, right, of the body itself. So that was very interesting, isn't it, Jeff?
It is very interesting. And I've heard, the alternatives too, that some people had them commissioned during their lifetime and actually hung them on the wall until the time of their death. And then
And
some
that's
after, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted to show. This rare thing is a first century framed Fayum portrait. So it seems, and this is nice stretcher bars. I saw that you were gessoing and stretching your own canvas the other
hmm
day. So the artists would stretch their own canvas or the boards, prepare the boards. And you could see a very distraught Fayum portrait. This is not well preserved, but it is a treasure just because of the stretcher bars, right? The construction. So it seems, just like what you said, a lot of people were so concerned with the death that they would ask for their portrait during their life, and they would live with that portrait. Now, this idea of the living with that portrait, eventually that portrait would become you. So it's kind of like your neighbors, you kind of tell it gets to watch you, it gets to know you better. So the soul would feel more comfortable if you lived with it. Also a very interesting idea, right? Knowing that
It
this
is,
portrait will,
yeah. It
that would
changes
go
the
on
way
your
you look
face.
at any portrait, doesn't it? Because you know that any portrait is going to last longer than you and see things that you won't see here literally. But I think when we look at the portraits we have now, photographs, right, we're still thinking of that those will at least be in the hands of our loved ones. It's very interesting.
Very extremely interesting, and for perfect transition to thinking about how these portraits, how the Fayum portraits influenced the history of art. Now, they were already unearthed during Renaissance in small amounts and were known about. And also, it's very interesting, going back to Apelles, the Greek artist. We know so much about him because there was so much written. He was celebrated. There were poems about it. There were descriptions of his paintings. None of his paintings survived. The only way we can imagine what his paintings look like is through the Fayum portraits technique, right? But this technique really influenced all of portraiture. And that's why it was so important, Jeff, what you just said. And I want to play a little game, and I'm going to show you 4 portraits and ask you for association of contemporary artists. Contemporary meaning Renaissance or Baroque or 19th century or 20th century, anybody that this portrait inspires you to think about, an artist from our era. So take a look at this guy and see if anybody comes to mind, a painting that you know, and I'd love to hear some artists. I'm going to give you a moment to quickly type up. Really don't overthink it, just any association that comes to mind. Jeff, do you have any?
Well, it's not fair because I know, right?
Use something else.
I can't get that out of my head. I'll give you a hint,
Okay.
though. Isn't this is a short Spanish guy, isn't it? Oh, we've got a couple Picasso. Somebody's saying Picasso.
Bingo.
There we
I
go.
completely agree with you. Look at this. So it's fun when we match with our associations, and that's why I didn't want to dominate with what I saw. I wanted to hear from our public. And yes, those planes on the face, even the deep jaws, right? The facial hair, the structure, the stare, the frontality, right? So one is 2nd century, one is 1901. Picasso was very well aware of masks, of Fayum portraits, was very interested in the relationship. Here is another one. Let's play this one. Now, you have all of art history to think about. It could be 1920th, Renaissance, any century you want to jump around. What I loved about it
I
is
don't
that
know which one you had for this one, but this guy reminds me of El Greco as extended face.
that would have been better. You win. You better than mine. Absolutely. This kind of elongation, and also
Yeah.
that we see it, it's a Moorish face. So
Hmm.
it's not a Greek or Roman face or even Egyptian. Very, very interesting portrait. Do you have any guesses from our astute audience?
We had some more on the one before. Somebody thought it reminded them of Van Gogh, which is another great one.
True. Very true. It almost makes you think of Van Gogh's textures as waxy when you that thickness of paint.
Looks like Alana says Delacroix.
Oh, excellent. Absolutely. Ilana, I completely agree with you. I'll show you one that came to my mind, but this is not to dominate, just to suggest another pairing. This is by Rubens. So this is 1620. Delacroix, of course, would have been closer to 1900s, end of 1800s. So absolutely, again, all I want to do is to show you how it informed our Western European tradition, how the Fayum portrait is always on the artist's minds. Here you could particularly see how the highlight in the forehead is very similar, the way that the three-dimensionality is achieved. Just fantastic. Here's one more. Could we play one more time? Let's look at this guy.
I love, you know what's different about this guy? Some others is he's smiling.
Oh, true. I didn't notice that. Excellent.
He's smiling more than the others. The others are much more somber. This guy's got a little wit to him. So I'm going to give him a late 18th century French, maybe Chardin.
Yeah, he looks to me so contemporary, right? He could
Yeah,
almost be even Lucian Freud, right? It
oh
could
yeah,
almost be the
the textures,
our
yeah.
time period.
Hmm.
Our wonderful audience, we want to hear from you. What does this make you think about? Which artist or artwork? And I love the eyes here are actually not enlarged, right? The nose is bigger than the eyes. That very
Yeah.
skimpy mouth, very large brows, receding hairline, and he's also chubby. He's not a skinny guy. But wonderful facial structure. I love how muted the tones, the colors are different here. It might be because he faded a little, but still slightly different palette. Anybody?
Julius Caesar, somebody says.
Yeah, true, true. He does look a bit with that kind of
We've,
heroic
we've got a
cynicism.
Rodney Dangerfield.
All right, I'm going to show you my pairing.
Ooh, I like that
Recognize
one.
this is a self-portrait. It's
Goya.
Goya. And it's kind of almost like a little time travel. It feels like it's so similar to me. The way the nose, the receded eyes, the heavy eyebrows, the chubby face, the sarcastic eyes and mouth. Beautiful, romantic vision of a portrait. Now, thank you so much for playing with us this little game. I want to introduce you to Arlene. Arlene is really interesting because she was found in a family grave, and it's a very famous burial for mummy portraits because she was found with her 3 daughters and also her husband. I do want to point out, just going to move my little square here, that in the grave there was a stele that commemorated a stone on which it was written who she was. It wasn't written about her husband, but there was a stone. She must have been a real matriarch. And it says Arlene, you could see it in Greek, also called Tenos, that was her nickname. She was daughter of Herodes, and she was much loved. It was said much loved. She died in year 10, age 35 years old, on the 7th of Mizor, which is one of the 12 Egyptian months. So quite a bit that we know about her. And I'm just going to...
And this one's on linen?
This one is on linen, and I want to compare her very quickly to the Ingres, Jean-Auguste Ingres, a French painter. And this is a drawing from the Frick collection. The reason I bring your attention to it is because of the amazing cross-hatching that we find here in this portrait. So this is most likely made with tempera paint, not encaustic, and on linen, as you noticed. But there's such a 19th century, almost 20th century feel to her. Really incredible. And so here are the 2 portraits of her daughters, and you could see likeness between all of them. And it's really interesting. So you find the actual mummies. Children were mummified and had their Fayum portraits painted as well, just like the grown-ups. And here in this portrait on the right, and also you could see it a little bit fainted on the left, the children are wearing the amulets. The fight against the death was very much on their minds. There were many infections, and children would wear these little amulets, often on black cords, with spells protecting them. And these amulets were worn not only for the living, but also to protect them in the underworld as they transitioned to the world of the dead. So they would preserve them through life and death. And here you can kind of imagine what the find would look like. But what's really interesting, the 2 daughters and Arlene are Fayum portraits. But her other daughter, her older daughter, has an Egyptian mask. And before the Romans arrived to the Fayum region, this is what the mummy were buried like. This is what we're familiar with. Even if we were to wear a costume for Halloween and thought about the Egyptian mummy, that's the kind of mask we would wear, right? So one of the daughters is buried that way, and this is the husband. You could see kind of a very strange hybrid between everything, more like a sculpture, but this was a mask worn on the mummy. So it occurred to me that maybe this is a cross-cultural marriage. Maybe that the husband comes from the Egyptian tradition, and Arlene with this Greek stele, comes from the Greek or Roman tradition. Maybe this is a mixed marriage. So they choose different ways to be remembered, right?
I have a guess too.
Tell.
I have a guess, and it goes back to the inscription on her stone. I'm guessing her father, much loved daughter, that he commissioned those pieces after the death of these other 2, and like you said, cross-cultural relationship.
And maybe in the older daughter, interesting, daughter to father, the older daughter seems to identify with the Egyptian father. So
Right.
You and I need to start writing a book here. We're going to make a lot of money on because nobody knows about this. Nobody has theories about it. So that's really interesting. So I want to switch to thinking about what happens again, the influence of Fayum portraits, and why do they stop? Why do we lose this tradition? Which is equally interesting. Why do we have them? Where did they come from? And how did they stop? So first, I want you to look at these two portraits, and I want the vote from our audience and tell us which one is the older, the one on the right or the one on the left? Which one is the older painting? If you had to guess, Jeff, which one would you pick?
The one on the left for me.
And tell us the reasons.
Well, because I know it's a Fayum portrait, and the other is an icon image.
Ah,
I'm guessing
okay.
from a full.
Okay. And funny enough, if I looked at them with a more of a naive eye, not knowing much about it,
That would be
first of
the
all,
opposite. Yeah.
the opposite,
Yeah.
the one on the left looks better preserved. The one on the left looks more realistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one on the right looks a little bit more stylized. So, and even the way the ears are painted. Look at the one on the right, looks in the wrong placement. The one on the left looks receding back, which is so hard. All my students know how hard it is to paint the ears. Also, the shin in the eyes, incredible shin in the eyes.
Yes.
The way the hair
Yes.
is painted, right? What does our audience think?
We've got different ones. So some on the right, some on the left. Somebody's recognizing St. Peter.
Excellent. Our audience not to be underestimated. So, yes, indeed, this is St. Peter. And it's just kind of, I wanted to take this naive approach for almost erasing everything that I know and look at it as a person who's never seen it before. But yes, this is an icon of St. Peter. It's one of the earliest icons, Byzantine icons that survives. The icon literally means an image, a reflection, like a mirror image. So it comes from the very similar tradition. And here I wanted to point out how much similarity between the mummy portraits and the icons there really was in the early tradition, Byzantine tradition. So first of all, the eyes, the fact that the icon would communicate with the pious, with the person who's coming towards it, the same way that the Fayum portrait is receiving you. The icon would receive the gaze of the one who's believing in it. The gilding. The Fayum portraits often had gilding added to them, so we think there's another interesting idea. When your portrait hung on the wall, you didn't have the gold or the gilding, but when it was added to your face, the gold was added as a decoration. So something about the transcendental, the spiritual, that the gold added a layer to the faith. So we have these huge, of course, circles around the saint, which are the to show its saint status, its holiness, the nimbus or the halo. And again, it seems to come from the Fayum tradition. The frontality of the pose, it's definitely not in profile. And also here, if I even go back, you'll notice the scratches where the gold came off. You see a dark underpainting, and you see the dark underpainting also on the left. So this tradition of painting in encaustic, St. Peter is painted in wax. This is an encaustic painting, and painting dark to light with 4 colors that you will remember. And even an interesting tradition that in order to paint the saint, it was also true for the painters of the Fayum portraits, you had to purify yourself, and the artist actually had to fast to cleanse their body so that there would be a clean vehicle for the art to embody them and transfer it into the icon and into the Fayum portrait. So this wonderful transference that we see in the tradition. And here we actually see one of the earliest portraits of Christ or images of Christ. And this is both St. Peter and Christ the Pantocrator. Is from St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. At some point, some of these icons traveled to the Getty Museum. That was an incredible exhibition at the Getty. We were lucky to see it. And the Getty site was actually sanctified. There were priests that came and sanctified the site so these icons could embed the exhibition. But here, what's so interesting, look at how the arms of Christ are folded. almost as the way that he's mummified, or the arms are coming together. And even the gesture of the fingers, you'll see this is a female mummy on the right, but if you look at the two fingers, the middle and the index, there's a similar gesture. So we have a transference of the ideas. Early saints were mummified, and the church looked down upon it, this tradition. It seemed like almost idolatry. So very quickly, around 5th and 6th and 7th century, we have a movement in the church that's called Iconoclasm, to start destroying these icons so that the people don't confuse praying to the icon instead of praying to the God. And so the Fayum Portraits tradition starts to disappear because it seems to be dangerous politically. That's how we lose that tradition, and it takes us much later to Renaissance to revive it again, to bring this realism to the portraits. So you know how much I love using my quotes, so I had to find a quote to start from, as you remember, to think about your everyday life and your afterlife. But here's a quote that always gives me goosebumps, and I want you to look at this stunning Fayum portrait. And just remember, in some of these portraits, there were little prayers, like in the icons embedded. One of the portraits was, we find an inscription, "Remember me." It's, whom is she talking to? Right? To you right now, not to anyone abstract, but to you right now in this moment. Remember me. In the icons, you often will find "Pray for me" scroll by the artist that they would leave inside the icon. So this is a poem by ancient Greek poet, and it transforms and solidifies of how this portrait should be looked at, and henceforth how we should look of portraits in general. Blessed is he who drew you, and blessed is the wax that knew how to be vanquished by your beauty. If only I could become a maggot or a creeping woodworm, so that I could crawl up and devour that wood. So imagine the portrait, the poet is describing his beloved, that the portrait has become their beloved, and they wish there were that maggot in the ground that would eat not their body but the portrait, and by eating the wood of the portrait they would feel unified in their love, and that death and life will be conquered and they would be together. I hope that you'll never think of another portrait the same way. I wanted to point out a few museums around the world. Here in Los Angeles, once the museums are open, please visit the Getty Villa. We have that famous mummy portrait that we talked about that was used for MRI, and we saw what's inside him. The site itself is beautiful. If you are in Europe, the British Museum houses an incredible collection, and that's where we find our wonderful man to which they did a study of forensic study of what his mummy would look like. And at the Metropolitan Museum, a beautiful room filled with gorgeous portraits. That's where the freed, liberated slave would live, and you would find him in that museum. But many other museums around the world house a few of these magnificent, mysterious portraits. This is a book by Doxiadis. We get many questions from our audience. What can they read? I would highly recommend this volume, The Mysterious Fayum Portraits, Faces from Ancient Egypt. This is a book that truly inspired me, and also I think I look like the person on that cover, so maybe that's why I like it.
I thought the woman during the poem looked more like you, Zhenya.
Yeah, I feel like I really connect to them, that I definitely take time travel there, and on a mission to tell their story.
Can you go back to the image at the Getty?
Yes.
This one here, you know, something that really caught my attention as I was looking at these preparing for today was how rough cut the portraits are. There's so much attention paid to the portrait itself, and I used to see them alone thinking, well, they're just that way because they were broken away from their mummy, but the way they were placed into the sarcophagi is very rough cut as well. It's interesting that they didn't take as much care having it shaped. There must have been something about the size of wood that they could have, or that was available, something that made them make this aesthetic choice.
So two ways to think about it. First of all, the wood itself. When we think of the wood portrait, we think of a panel, like a Dutch panel, right?
Right.
This is a very thin cypress wood, which is cut to the 2 millimeters. It's
Mm-hmm.
very thin panels, and so they
Right.
actually bow in time and they kind of
Right.
round out to the shape. So they're literally more of masks than wood
Mm-hmm.
panels. And second, they were always more of a rectangular images.
Right.
And we think that they were more normal, like a painting that we would have. And
Mm-hmm.
then they were cut out to place in the
Cut
mummy,
out to
right?
place in,
So
yeah.
there's
Yeah.
this strange transference where, again, like this disrespect almost to the artwork itself, but then there's disrespect to the face of the person because that gets shoved down, right? So there's this strange, right,
Yeah.
sacrifice that they're doing in order to just capture and bring the soul alive in a way that's surprising to us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so I want to go to your slide, Jeff. I've talked
Right. Somebody
enough.
wanted to see the book again too,
Oh,
for
yes,
the
let's
title of
look
the
at
book. So we'll stop there real quick. There you go.
You can find it on Amazon, on eBay. There are many, I think, reprints of it. This is the original version that I have from '95. It's beautiful reproduction, lots of stories, and it's written through a point of view of an artist. Doxiadis is both art historian and an artist. She became interested in Fayum portraits as a portrait painter, like myself. So there, for anyone who appreciates them as works of art and not just artifacts, that's the book.
There's some interesting YouTube videos too, if you want to just type in Fayum portraits that are fun to watch.
And the Getty Villa gives you the simulation of that mummy and getting inside, seeing the radiography and the IBIS, very wonderful animations too.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I wanted to share a few things with everybody. As we have been going through these last episodes, we started talking and saying how it would be neat to share some type of artistic technique or application that related to the subject. And of course, this week was perfect, looking at encaustics, that we could talk about how you can make your own encaustics using Rembrandt oil paints. It's actually a very simple process. It does require a few extra tools, but it's within everyone's reach, I think, to paint with encaustics. You can go and buy pre-made encaustics, but they're also very easy. If you're already an oil painter, for example, or oil painting something you're familiar with, there's just a couple extra steps, and I've written them down here, and I'll read through it with you and add a little bit of information. So you need, of course, your Rembrandt oils, and the reason I'm recommending Rembrandt is you want to have that high pigment load, that very extra fine milled pigment. That's going to give you the best result for color. Then you need beeswax, and you can get natural beeswax or refined beeswax. The real difference is the color. The natural beeswax still has the pollen in it, so it's a little yellowish, and refined is more clear because all that's taken out. So you want some beeswax, and you can
Where do
find
you
this
get
in
it?
art supply stores. What's that?
Where do you get it?
You can get it at art supply stores. It comes in chunks or pellets. Some of it's refined, some of it's natural. And there are other places too. You can buy beeswax at craft and hobby stores. So there's other purposes for it, obviously, but it can be used as long as it's a natural 100% beeswax, natural or refined. Damar crystals are an important ingredient. These you can also find usually in a bag or a jar at your local art supply store. Damar is a type of tree resin. It's like a sap that's been dried and crystallizes. So you'll need that, and what it does is it makes the paint film stronger and allows you to polish it up a little bit too and make it shine. So you want to have that in there so your surface isn't too soft. A couple important tools is an electric skillet. If you already have one, great. If not, they're really easy to find at like a thrift store or a Goodwill store, or you can buy one new. And then just a little aluminum muffin tray or little muffin cups are great. I even have had friends use cleaned up old tuna fish cans with the paper taken off, obviously. So something that you can set in the skillet or on the skillet that can be heated. So here are the directions once you've got those things together. You want to heat your skillet to about 220 degrees. And it's important you don't get hotter than that. So if you trust the temperature and thermometer on your skillet, you're great. If it doesn't have that on your skillet, it just has like medium, high, then you'll need some type of thermostat. Because if it gets hotter than that, the wax will actually start to burn. And not only is that inconvenient, it can be hazardous. So make sure you don't exceed that temperature. You place your tray, your muffin tray, your individual cups right onto the top of the skillet. So just like you're cooking. And then you add the beeswax in. And then after that, the Damar crystals. Some people start with the crystals. Some people start with the beeswax. It really isn't as important. I guess the thing to note is that the Damar does take longer to melt down. And one thing that will help speed that up is if you crush it a little more. It comes in kind of these rocky, gravelly bags. So if you put it in a Ziploc bag and kind of hammer it down a little bit into a finer powder, that will make it melt faster. And as far as the ratio, I recommend 7-to-1 ratio. Some of the pre-made, you can actually buy wax with Damar in it, ready to go. They're usually about a 5-to-1 ratio, wax to Damar. But I always like to start a little less and build up to what you like as far as how much Damar you want in there. So I'm recommending 7-to-1. So once you have that all completely melted and you've got that liquid wax Damar composition, now it's time to add the paint. So you choose your color. Maybe you want to stick just to the same palette as the Fayum with your black and red and yellow, ochre and white. So you could start with that or whatever colors you choose. And the ratio is about 15%. So 15% oil paint to your 85% wax Damar mixture. You don't want to exceed 25%. If you get up in that higher percentage range, like 50-50 equal amounts, the paint will never dry. It'll just be this gooey mess. So just a little bit of oil paint, 15% is what I recommend. And you mix that together and the color will spread out pretty quickly. It won't take long for it to distribute and be absorbed into the wax medium. And then you're ready to paint. So you can apply it with a brush, and I will say these have to become dedicated brushes. Once you start using them with encaustic, you can't use them with anything else. And you'll see that that paint will dry pretty quickly. And you can let your little tins of color dry. You can pop them out like in this picture and save them, or you can just reheat the tin when you're ready to paint again. And that's all there is to it. And I have one tip for folks. It's a good idea. Don't have to do this, but it's a good idea to leach some of the excess oil out of the paint. And you do that by the night before, for example, maybe squeezing a little bit of paint, oil paint out onto a piece of cardboard or paper towels. And that will absorb the excess oil overnight. So the next day you've got a higher, a little thicker piece of paint, but it's a less oil content. And that mixes a little bit better. So that's a tip to get a better color ratio. But that's all there is to it. Just don't burn yourself.
So helpful, Jeff. And for those of you who don't paint portraits, you can actually make a beautiful abstract painting with this technique or a still life. So we have a secret agenda of turning everybody who watches this into an artist because you can. They're so beautiful. And so with that, how to win, we are encouraging you to create a Halloween mask inspired by Fayum Portrait. If you want to, you could use encaustic technique or you could use any kind of material. There is lots to choose from, including the Rembrandt materials. And please tag us so we will find you and be able to announce the winner. So you want to tag the Invisible Museum Tours and the Art Academy, and of course Royal Talents North America. So it has Royal Talents NA at the end, and that is so we can find your post and share it with the winners next time we do our tour in November. So I hope that we had a great journey for you in changing how you think about, maybe not changing or adding to how you think about portraiture. If there's any other last minute thoughts or questions, Jeff, should we check if there's anything that our audience
I'll look
wants
through
to
here.
know?
I'm going to sweeten the deal for folks here. Earlier I mentioned that there was a artist, contemporary artist that uses encaustic. If you can name him, I will throw in a Rembrandt apron, and I'll give you a couple of hints. He was a pop artist. And the paintings he used primarily with encaustic were of American flags. So
Oh, I
there's your
think I know. I
hint.
think I know.
Somebody contemporary who used encaustics. And there are lots of artists who use encaustics today too, but he's one in particular, I think, in art history notable. So add him in there and I will throw in an apron.
And those aprons are great. I have mine over here. It makes me feel like a great artist right away because it says Rembrandt
Absolutely.
on it.
It says Rembrandt on it, right? How can you go wrong?
Any other,
All right.
while there's thinking about it, so is there any other last minute thoughts before we see them next time?
I think we're getting some typing here. They're coming
Hey,
through.
next, just to whet your appetite, we will be talking about Albrecht Dürer next time, who is one
Mm,
of the greatest Renaissance painters, is definitely a greatest celebrated German artist, and you do not want to miss his
no,
symbolism is so incredible.
he is. He was a prodigy and super talent. That'll be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to that. Oh my God, don't type that in there, you guys. And his last name's not right there. So the first name you got right. People are guessing already. So that's wonderful. Um, yeah, so they're still coming through. Mostly it's just great gratitude, and I want to express that too, Zhenya. It is always wonderful to hear your interpretations of these wonderful art objects and the story behind them. And this was certainly a wonderful trip. There's some thanks for the recipe for drying in caustics. So wonderful. We have a comment there. So lots of appreciation and
Great,
from me
great.
as
Well, I
well.
look
Thank you so
forward.
much,
Yeah.
Zhenya.
Well, I will look forward to reading through your comments afterwards. Everybody's comments I always answer. So if you have questions continuously, I come back to it throughout the weeks. And this is a discussion, a forum for us. I live this whole month enjoying your thoughts. So thank you for our audience to make it special. We do not mean to make another lecture. We really believe in this interactive approach that's different, and hearing from you in real time matters, and even discussion afterwards. Jeff, you are always a joy. Thank you so much. Until
Thank you.
next month, the date will be announced. Do not miss it. It will be some Monday in November.
Fantastic. We'll see everybody then.